Well, I was going to do this video anyway, and it turns out that my friend Stephanie Quick actually beat me to the topic. But I listened to her version of her critique, and we are coming at this topic from different vantage points. So in the description to this video, I will put her video in, and you can watch both of them and get all of our critiques. And what are we critiquing? Well, we are critiquing David Paulides and his 411, missing 411 theory. And for those of you who are not familiar with David Paulides, he is an investigator. He started out investigating Bigfoot and things like that. And he was drawn to some peculiar cases of disappearance in the national parks. And this is human disappearance. And according to his story, at one point he was pulled aside by some national park rangers and kind of given the skinny on rashes of disappearances that occur in the national parks in particular. And so that's sort of what got him started. And he makes a series of interesting, not claims really so much, but more implications. He draws implications from the various cases that he has culled together. And he believes that, like, he at one time was a police detective. He believes that just as police detectives do, homicide detectives do, he has developed a profile of these cases which indicate that there are places, principally in North America, that's where he's concentrated most of his time, although he has looked at the clusters of disappearances in other places, but that there's a pattern to certain types of disappearances in the United States, centering principally in the national parks, but also in some other areas, and that these disappearances have a profile, and that this profile is not a normal profile, in the sense that some of the same patterns keep showing up, he says, but these people disappear, or they are found dead in mysterious circumstances. Actually, Stephanie does a really good job of describing the profile, and so I will let you see what this is. But there have been critiques, a number of critiques of his approach over the years, because a lot of the way in which he attempts to do this, in which he attempts to draw all these things together, even though he himself claims that he is not speculating on what is causing these disappearances. And some of the disappearances are odd. I mean, I'm not going to say that some of them aren't odd, but he also, even though he claims he's not speculating, the one thing that he does do is, by refusing to speculate, but yet presenting these patterns, he gives the impression that something otherworldly or really odd, or maybe paranormal, or beyond the realm of normalcy is going on in a lot of these cases, or in many of these cases. And just as someone myself who deals with investigation and statistics and is used to looking at databases, he basically created his own database that is then going to provide sort of the rubric through which, and the lens through which, he's going to look at all disappearances. And as someone who has created, databases herself, what I can tell you is that, at least in creating this database, all right, he goes back. One of the things he does in his books, and he's published a number of books now, is he goes back to ancient records, or not ancient records, but he goes back to, they seem ancient to us now, I suppose, but he goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, older cases of disappearances. And he often uses some of the particulars. He'll cull through those cases, and he'll say, see, here's a profile, here's the beginning of a cluster where a bunch of other people disappear and things like that. And the problem with some of that is that in many cases, especially these older cases, we don't know all the details, and there's absolutely no way to know them. There's no way to know the contexts under which some of those people disappeared. It's not even clear in many cases that investigations were done in the same way that they are done now, in the event of disappearances in the past. So using these as a foundation is problematic at best. Whenever you're dealing with older accounts, and I can speak from experience as someone who does this all the time in my work. Whenever you're dealing with older accounts, you always have to take into account the manner in which those stories were reported. What was the cultural manner in which those things were reported? And if you don't take that into account, there's no way that you can really use them as evidence in the same way. Obviously, people have disappeared under bizarre circumstances. This has always happened. We have stories in every culture. There are stories about children being spirited away, or adults suddenly disappearing, or whenever someone disappears suddenly, it isn't, especially for the people who love them, it is an uncanny experience. I can speak to this myself, and I will in a little bit, as I'll share a story of someone that I personally knew who disappeared and has never been seen since. So it's an odd feeling. It fills you with dread because you don't know what occurred. When I first was exposed to David Paulides' stuff, and it was probably, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, it wasn't long after he'd published his first couple books. One of the things that I noticed almost immediately in some of his work was that even though he likes to provide a profile of a basic profile of the types of disappearances that he's looking at, there is also some evidence that he cherry picks a little bit. In other words, if you actually look at the number of disappearances that occur, and I have looked at some of the same sources that Stephanie Quick has looked at, if you actually look at the number of people who have disappeared or have died under mysterious circumstances, and what that means is unknown circumstances, say in Yosemite or the Rocky Mountain National Park or along the Appalachian Trail, or the Smokey Mountain Park, which I've been to many times, you'll find that there are lots of people, over the course of history who've had odd disappearances or tragic deaths. Even here in the Hudson Valley, there are a couple of places here in the Catskills where people die with startling regularity, and there are people who disappear here too. There's been a young woman who disappeared here in Saugerties not long ago, and she hasn't been seen, and no one knows where she is. A few years ago, there was another young man from Saugerties who died, and there was CCTV camera footage showing him down in downtown Kingston at a certain point, and then he just disappeared. It was and his body was found 18 months later, and there is no explanation for how his body got to where it ended up. We don't know. He was one of those young men who had been out drinking. So why Paulides didn't latch onto this, I don't know. I think it's a matter of what he hears about and what fits his particular scheme that he's looking at. So there are lots of people who disappear, but that doesn't mean that there is this vast conspiracy of disappearing people. So that's the first thing. It's the criteria keep shifting, and there are different criteria depending on whether he's talking about the national parks or whether he's talking about what he does in this book, which is him looking into the strange disappearances of young men who've drunk alcohol and end up in the water, drowned, or apparently drowned. And I'll talk about the problems with this book in just a minute. So I think the difficult thing is that he seems to imply by his collection of stories that there is something untoward going on, that there is something unknown going on, and furthermore, that the government knows that something's going on, or that government officials know that something is going on, and they refuse to investigate it or admit that. And who knows? I mean, I'm sure that there are all kinds of things and all kinds of people and beings that are in various of our national and state parks, including probably human traffickers and drug gangs and murderers and just people who don't like other people being around them in the wilderness. There have been a number of incidences, for example, up in the Adirondacks state park, where individuals who've been camping in fairly isolated areas have encountered individuals who apparently live in the woods there and don't like other people coming around them and have had really strange interactions with them. So there are a number of cases like that. Anyway, so that's the first thing. I noticed this about Paulides from the beginning, even though I do think, and this is to give him some credit, I do think that he has brought some important cases to light. He certainly has collected, since he's collected so many cases, he has certainly collected some cases that are very odd. They're just odd. You know, the evidence is odd. If he's relaying the evidence correctly, it is odd. There have been a couple of cases, one that I can think, I can't remember now specifically which did. Oh, I know what it was. It's that famous case of the little boy who disappeared in the Smoky Mountains, Smokey Mountain National Park. And this is one of his cases that in his early book he talks about a lot, that this is the case that sort of drove him. And this was an interesting case in the sense that there was some visual evidence, at least, that the child had been abducted by a human being. It was interesting because the FBI and various other federal agencies were brought into the search for this kid in a manner that is unusual, actually. And so the question then would be, well, why were these federal agencies brought in if they didn't think there was something going on there? Well, there might have been something going on there. There might have been, the FBI might have been keeping track of a human trafficking group, or there might have been several other incidences involving attempted abductions of children that the FBI knew about, but that the local authorities didn't know about. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things when you have those kinds of jurisdictional crossings. It's difficult to know, which even Paulides admits. What is interesting, though, is, and I neglected to do this research to find the specific episode, but the very same missing child case that he brings up in his early books that spurred him on, that inspired him into this, is one of the disappearances that is covered in an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. And if I find this before I put this up, I will put this in the description. But what's interesting is that if you watch the Unsolved Mystery case, if you watch it and then you read David Paulides' account, what you'll notice is that there are some significant divergences between the two accounts, and they were using much the same sources. They both interviewed the kid's father and the other members of the family. They interviewed other witnesses, and what I noticed is that there was that David Paulides only picked out those items of interest and information that fit a theory that he was already working towards. And that's that is, that may be the way that homicide detectives work sometimes, because I know that homicide detectives have been accused of this, depending on how they're trained. I'm not saying all of them do, but homicide detectives don't work quite the same as regular researchers. Homicide detectives, and I've known a few, they are interested in solving a case. And to that end, depending on how they've been trained and what they are led towards, and the pressure that they are under to solve a case, they oftentimes will look at only the data that seems to be leading them towards a conclusion that they want to get to, rather than looking at all the data that is available. That's part of the reason why cold cases, for example, or cases with questionable convictions, there are many times you can go back, somebody else can go back and relook at those things or reopen those cases again, and they realize, the original detectives missed this whole raft of stuff. And it's not because homicide detectives are bad people. They are people, and they are people that are trained in a certain way to look at evidence in a certain fashion. And depending on who they are, and depending, again, like on, the context, the politics and contexts that they were working within at the time, they may or may not be able to see the forest for the trees, so to speak. And if you read David Paulides' account of this missing boy from the Smoky Mountains, and you watch the Unsolved Mystery episode of the same story, you'll realize that David Paulides has left out some very important bits of data that changed the nature and complexion of that story. Still a tragic story. Okay, still a tragic story. It's a tragic story any way you go. So I read a whole bunch of David Paulides' stuff. In fact, one of the things he likes to say is, well, people who don't agree with me haven't read my books. I'm sorry, I have read your books. I've read all of your books. And it's not that I think that all of them suck or that some of these cases aren't important cases. I do, in fact, think that it may be the case that the National Park Service doesn't like to talk about people who disappear or are killed in the national parks in order that it will kill tourism. I mean, duh, New York New York City can be a dangerous place too. And, the Tourist Bureau in New York City doesn't talk about all the murders and the gang violence in New York City because it wants people to come to Broadway. I mean, that's kind of a duh thing, that is not proof of a conspiracy. It's proof of just plain old politics is what that's proof of. Where he finally lost me, though, where I finally realized that I had to part company with his method, was when he wrote this book, Missing 411, a sobering coincidence. And in this, he's looking at cases of mysterious or odd deaths of young college-age young men who are often inebriated and then disappear, and then oftentimes are found in water, drowned. And he bases his work, his whole, he talks about why he was drawn to these particular cases. And he says that he used a couple of books in order to sort of provide the framework for this. And one of the books is called Case Studies in Drowning Forensics by Professor D. Lee Gilbertson and New York City homicide detective Kevin Gannon. Okay. So I decided when I first got this book that I would actually look that book up, because that's the way I am, because some of the cases that he presents in here are interesting. And almost immediately when I started looking up that book, I found that there was a lot of controversy about this book. And the controversy was mostly focused around the homicide detective Kevin Gannon. And it had to do with Kevin Gannon's participation in developing the Smiley Face murder hypothesis. And some of you have probably heard of this. This is this hypothesis that a number of young men who were inebriated, most college-age men, died or disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and in places where their bodies were found, allegedly there was a weird little smiley face. This is the idea behind this, and in fact, Kevin Gannon uses one of the so-called victims of the Smiley Face Killer, one of the victims, the case of one of the victims, as one of the case studies in this book that he writes called Case Studies in Drowning Forensics. There are two problems with that. The first is that despite the fact that this book has remained in print, there are a lot of problems with the book. The book is in fact not used widely by most police investigation and training corps for looking at drowned victims. Because in the first place, it uses 14 case studies, which in forensics is not a big enough sample size. And there have been plenty of drowning victims that could be used to talk about this. So, just using 14 case studies is really not sufficient. And I've actually talked to people that I know personally who are forensic pathologists who have talked about the problems with some of the conclusions that Kevin Gannon draws in this book about, what you can conclude about certain types of evidence connected to certain kinds of drowning, etc. Drowning victims, finding victims in water is very complicated for any number of reasons. And there might be lots of reasons why someone drowns or dies and then falls in water or ends up in water. And he just doesn't cover it all. In other words, it's not a complete enough book. So that's the first problem. The second problem for Gannon is that and there's been quite a bit of work that has been done on this, and I will actually put a link up to kind of a discussion blog that looks at some of the problems. But the FBI and many other law enforcement agencies, large law enforcement agencies around the country, have drawn the conclusion that there is in fact no evidence linking a lot of these cases, and that there is evidence that Kevin Gannon, in at least 2 or 3 of the, it's not entirely clear, 2 or 3 of the cases that he studied in which he claimed that he found evidence of that smiley face graffiti, that in fact that evidence was placed. In other words, he placed it there. And in fact, once he was accused of that, once it came to light that at least in one case in particular, he actually planted the smiley face evidence, he immediately retired, and he will not talk to the public at all. Now, what's unfortunate about this particular case is that this is one case in which there is evidence that the victim in question was in fact murdered and didn't actually just simply get drunk and die. But the confusion surrounding that evidence has made it difficult for detectives who want to actually investigate the evidence that is there to go forth and do it, because they don't want to be associated with this case that has been besmirched by falsified evidence. The point in all of this is that this is the book and this is the guy that forms the basis for this book. A homicide detective who wrote a book which is not considered to be a good book or a definitive authoritative book, despite the fact that it has remained in print. And the main reason it's remained in print is because David Paulides has touted it, all right? So he's basing this book on the research and conclusions of a homicide detective that retired after he was accused, and with good evidence of falsifying data or evidence at a site where he wanted to prove that the victim was a victim of the Smiley Face Killers. So there you go. It's like, okay, buddy, David, you've got some good cases here, but the person that you're using as your foundation is someone who is questionable. And what that does is it throws all of the way you do things into question. And of course, his response to that is, no, it's all a cover-up. You don't understand what I'm doing. You're just trying to victimize me. It's like, no one's trying to victimize you. All of us would like to get to the bottom of these deaths, whether they are homicides or not. But you do not help your case when you use as the basis for your research an individual who has been discredited by the very people that we depend on to do these kinds of investigations to begin with. And I'm sorry, not every homicide detective can be corrupt. Not every homicide detective agency and department can be corrupt. I mean, it's like, good Lord, it's like, I will be the first to say that state, federal, and local agencies sometimes cover up stuff, but not everybody's covering up stuff. That it just doesn't work that way. As Stephanie Quick put it, it's like, and you are a homicide detective, David, so it's like, why should we listen to you rather than all of your colleagues who are still in the field doing this work? Okay, so that's that question. And I would like to end this actually by talking about my own experience in trying to come to terms with the disappearance of a young man that I knew, whose disappearance actually does fit the profile of many of these guys right here, but who we're all pretty sure died a different way. His name was Alexis Dillard. He was a senior when I met him. I taught him for 2 semesters of Western Civ at the University of Kansas. He took my first semester in the fall and the second semester in the spring, and that was his senior year. So he was finishing up so that he could graduate. And Alexis was a young man, a young man in his 20s. He came from a prominent family. I think his father was a lawyer in Wichita, Kansas. I believe is Wichita, Kansas. And he had plenty of money, and he had a future set out for him. And he was a little bit arrogant, a little bit stuck up. I could tell he was a little bit of a ladies' guy. And especially the second semester, he was suffering from what we call senioritis. It's like he was doing he knew he was going to graduate, so he was doing the bare minimum that he had to do in all of his different classes. And but we talked, and he had taken my second semester because he liked me and he liked the way I taught, and he thought that I would probably teach the second semester the same basic way I taught the first, which is largely true, although it was a different set of topics. So anyway, the last I saw him was the morning of the day that he disappeared. Semester had basically ended. He had a final project to turn in. I gave the students a choice. They could either take a final exam or they could do a final project of some type. And he had told me he wanted to do a final project rather than a final exam, which was fine with me. But he wanted to discuss it with me a little bit. So we met outside of the student union as I was walking back to my car. And we walked for a couple blocks and just talked. And he talked about, what he was going to do. And when he would turn it in, it would be, there were a few days left for it to be turned in. And I can't remember even what it was. But we talked, and you know, he was pleasant, and we said our goodbyes, and that was it. Well, 2 days later, I got word that he had disappeared. And these are the circumstances under which he had disappeared. This was 1993, the spring of 1993. The year of 1993 was a year in which the entire Missouri, Mississippi basin, that whole area, the Kansas River, the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, that whole area was undergoing a 500-year flood. The rain was horrific. The storms, the weather was terrible. And it had been really wet all spring. And apparently he had gone down to this place, this little bar, which I'm very familiar with. I've eaten there, I've drunk there, in northern Lawrence. That's right on the Kansas River. It's right in North Lawrence, right as you go over the bridge into North Lawrence. It's called Johnny's Tavern. And it's a popular place for students to go. And he had just turned 21, so he was just old enough that he could go into Johnny's. Although, to be honest, at that time, this was 1993, they didn't always card people if you went in early. So anyway, he apparently had gone in and been drinking with a bunch of his buddies. He was a member of a fraternity. And he, according to the people there, he had bragged that he was going to try to swim the Kansas River right at that point, because literally the Kansas River is only about maybe 100 yards away from the bar. And he had swum it before, apparently, and he made the claim he was going to swim it again. Well, it would have been really dangerous for him to swim it because there had been lots of rain, there had been flooding, and they had actually opened, there's like a little dike there, kind of a dam there, and they had opened the sluices on the dam. So water was rushing through there, and that creates a very dangerous situation on the leeward side of the dam. You know, it creates riptides, underwater currents and whirlpools and all kinds of stuff. And but he claimed he was going to do it, and that was the last thing that anybody saw of him. You know, he left the bar, and literally has never been seen since. No one has ever seen him. They had no CCTV there, so his exit was not recorded. And the only thing they found, and they don't know if this had anything to do with him, is they found a footprint down by the bank, off the bank of the Kansas River, on where he would have entered the water if he had entered the water. On the north side, but the problem and the footprint seemed to be similar to the types of shoes that he was wearing, but it was facing away from the river. It wasn't like going towards the river. It was only one footprint, so it was never conclusive that it belonged to him one way or the other. But he literally disappeared. He has never been seen since. He has never been heard from since. There's never been any sign of him ever since. And when that happened, it was very shocking. It was like, because there were many people in my class that knew him. The people that were in fraternities and sororities knew him. And it was just really weird, and troubling. It was a troubled, what the theory was, and what the working theory still is that he did try to swim, and in his inebriated state, he would have been overcome by the rapids very, very quickly, and he would have been swept into the machinery of the dam, and he literally, and this is awful, but he literally would have been torn to pieces by the machinery there, and probably because of the flood water, buried in sediments, and all of his clothing and everything. I mean, nothing has been found. No, not a tennis shoe, not a shred of clothing. Nothing has been found. Obviously, there were all kinds of rumors that sprung up after his disappearance. His family did not launch a huge search. There were some questions about why they did not do that. I tend to think it's probably because they accepted the explanation that he drowned. And there may have been something about him that they knew, you know, that maybe he was prone to doing this kind of thing or something. His family has never made any public statement about his disappearance, which I've always found that to be odder than the disappearance itself. But and there have been several of his friends that over the years have occasionally sort of resurrected his case to see if any new information can come up. There were rumors that a person resembling his appearance was seen hitchhiking just down the road about 2 miles off of I-70. The I-70 overpass is about 2 miles due north of that position. And so there were rumors that someone resembling his appearance was seen hitchhiking not long later that night, but those were never confirmed. So literally we have no explanation for why this kid died or disappeared. We don't know that he died, but we're assuming that he probably did. And in light of that, you know, me and his friends and his family just have to accept the fact that he probably died in this kind of mundane way. But that doesn't mean that his disappearance was any less strange. You know, when somebody just disappears and there is no evidence and there is no indication of what happened and there is no explanation, it is unsettling. And over the years, I have thought about him many times, wondering whether there would have been any possibility that he could be alive, wondering, and I didn't even know him. He was just a student of mine, whatever that means, you know. It's not like his family. But to be talking to someone and just a few hours later, they literally disappear from our reality as far as we know, you know what I mean? It's that they are never seen again. It is very strange. And the fact is, and Stephanie Quick gives a lot of really good pointers on this in her video. The fact is that when people disappear in circumstances that involve water or circumstances that involve the woods or anything outside, it is often really, really difficult to locate those people, even if we have a sense of where they are. I mean, there are even many cases, as we know, where murderers who killed someone will say, well, I buried so-and-so in this place, and they'll go and they'll look, and they won't find anything there. Or maybe they'll dig around and they'll find the body in a slightly different place. You know, this is assuming that the person who is saying that, well, you know, they may be screwing around with you, but they may not remember either. You know, these kinds of things are traumatic. They're difficult. And they're strange in and of themselves without adding an extra layer of potential strangeness. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that I don't think that there aren't some conspiracies, and it doesn't mean that I don't think that there are some really odd disappearances. The one merit of Paulides' work, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is that because he creates such a large database, he does come across some cases that are pretty weird, that are pretty weird. You know, when you actually look at the evidence and you try to figure out what could have happened, you know, even experts are like, we have no idea what happened here. This is just completely bizarre, you know. And we would expect that there would be some cases like that. You know, we don't know. There are all kinds of weird things that happen. I mean, I just got finished rereading the book And It Came From Hell, which is an amazing book by Bonar Menninger about the Topeka tornado. And one of the really interesting things he does in this book is in accounting different people's experience of the great Topeka tornado of 1966 as it moves through the city, is that he includes accounts in there of just really weird stuff that happened, premonitions that people had, voices that people heard that told them to hide in certain ways or in certain places or to do certain things that were contrary to their common sense that actually ended up saving them. You know, there are just interesting, and he doesn't comment on them. He just includes them because they are part of the human experience of large traumatic events. You know, when I think of how I felt about Alexis disappearing, I'm left with two things. I believe that probably he drowned, that probably he did that and he drowned, and so the explanation of his disappearance is prosaic. But I also can't deny how weird the fact of his disappearance felt to me, and probably felt to his friends and his family who never saw him again. You know, so both of those things exist together. The other criticism that I have of Paulides, and this is the last one that I'll mention, although he's been getting better on this, and I will give him this, is that in compiling the kinds of reports that he has compiled, he has, and trying to make them all sound weird, he has overlooked some very, very obvious clusters of human disappearance that more than likely involve human agency, including the ongoing issue of indigenous women and children disappearing, and not into these residential schools because they don't go there anymore. But there is a rash of these things, of these disappearances that's been going on for at least 40 to 50 years in this country, and that is ongoing, and that I have evidence of, and other people do, are linked to various syndicates of human trafficking. And I say that because I actually knew someone in high school whose mother had been trafficked in this way, and she and her older sister were being groomed by their father, who had purchased their mother to be stuck into this network. And believe me, at the time, I was a kid. I was in high school. I didn't know that this is what was going on. And by the time I figured out what was going on, like 30 years later, of course, these people are disappeared. They're gone. I can't find them. I don't know where they are. There's no one to report to any, you know, there's nothing to report anymore. But there are human agencies and human conspiracies that have to do with the drug trafficking, human trafficking, and sex trafficking, which is connected obviously to human trafficking, that are probably responsible for certain types or clusters of disappearance in certain places. And there are in fact clusters of disappearance. If you look at David Paulides' map that he produces, you'll notice that he really focuses on disappearances in the national parks, and it leaves out the entire middle of the country. Well, I can speak again from personal research and experience, that there are huge clusters of human disappearance in the Midwest, in the very places that he completely ignores. And he probably ignores them because they don't fit his particular profile. In other words, he could say, oh, well, you know, you can attribute these to human trafficking. Screw you, Paulides. Aren't those people just as important as your stupid profile? I mean, if you're really interested in solving the mysteries of human disappearance, why don't you look at some of these, at the disappearances of indigenous women, at the rash of disappearances of Latinx and African American people in certain urban settings that clearly also has to do with human trafficking. I mean, good Lord, you know, it's not just the human disappearances that interest you, okay? You know, so that's been my last beef about him. You know, it's like, oh, I'm only interested in the human disappearances that can't be explained in other ways. Well, the problem with some of these other human disappearances is that, yeah, you can explain them, but they're still unsolved. You still don't know who's doing it, okay? So why don't you stick to that? You know, do something useful instead of developing a theory that just creates rumors and more conspiracy. And you know, be useful. You know, even more useful. Now, to his credit, he has started mentioning some of those things. He hasn't really started looking into them, but he has started mentioning them. So probably someone else has gotten on to him about this. But anyway, what I'm going to do in the description is I'm going to put some links. One link will be to a really bizarre documentary. It's not actually a documentary. It's a movie that was done about someone who disappeared that was linked to the Smiley Face killings, but it's a possible explanation for what is going on with the Smiley Face killings, but it's done in a Blair Witch style. But what is interesting about it, it's really weird. It's kind of an exploitation film, but what is interesting about it is that it does provide kind of a theory at the very end of it as to what might be going on with some of these people. You know, in other words, if we believe that the Smiley Face Killers might be a real gang or something real, this is what they might actually be up to. Although it's important to understand that these links have been discredited. But it is kind of creepy. And then I'll also give links to a couple of articles that talk about the Smiley Face Killers and why that theory has been largely debunked. And if I can find the article about or the information about the young boy who David Paulides kind of uses as his model case that I mentioned earlier, I'll put that in the description as well. But and also Stephanie's YouTube that she does, because she has a whole different set of discussion. But anyway, I'm even longer than her now. So those are my complaints about Paulides, and now he can come after me too. I guess he's been coming after Stephanie, but now he can come after me as well.